Hello and welcome to the Marley Bird YouTube channel, brought to you by Red Heart Yarns. In this video, I will show you how to make the stylish knit doggy sweater. This sweater is absolutely adorable and it is relatively easy to construct. The hardest part is just being able to combine the increases with the stitch pattern that we will learn in the video. This is a free pattern on the Red Heart website. I've put a link to the free pattern in the video description box right down there below. And as my kids say, please smash that like button when you're down there getting that link so that way other people know you have enjoyed this video. Once you have the free pattern, go ahead, gather your materials, and join me back here, and I'll walk you through the different things that you need to know in order to complete this really great sweater for your furry loved one. Before we begin with the pattern, there's a couple things I want to point out. There are 4 different sizes to this pattern, so you need to decide which size is going to be best for your doggy and make sure you follow the instructions for that size throughout the pattern. In the notes section of the pattern, there are some very important information as far as how this doggy sweater is constructed. We will begin this dog sweater flat with straight needles, but there will be a time when we're making the sweater and we will need circular needles and double pointed needles. So I do want to point that out. The other thing I want to point out is that when we work our increases, we will be doing increase rows back to back, separated by one plain knitting row. So we will do increase, increase, plain, increase, increase, plain when it's time to get to that point. The increases that Jody Lawanda, the designer, chose to use for this doggy sweater are the Make One and the Make One Purl. I will walk you through as easily and quickly as I can how to do those very simple increases. All right, those are the big information things I want to point out. Now let's go ahead and jump in. After you've chosen what size sweater you are going to make, you want to cast on the number of stitches as indicated in the pattern for that size. I prefer the long tail cast on, so I have gone ahead and put a slip knot on my needle and I'm beginning the long tail cast on. Because I want to show you here at the start just briefly how to do these stitches, I'm just going to cast on a few stitches here. You can use any cast on you wish, but for me, I really like the long tail cast on. I think it's a wonderful edge to your project, and so I highly recommend using the long tail. One thing you'll notice with the long tail cast on is you get this really nice corded edge. And on the opposite side, you'll notice they look like purl bumps. This side is the side that I like to make my right side. So when I jump into my pattern and I begin and I'm looking at my purl bumps, this is going to be my wrong side, and I'm beginning my knit one, purl one ribbing. I want to make sure I'm beginning with the wrong side of my fabric. So I will actually begin with the purl one and then knit one, purl one, knit one all the way down the row. You will begin with your purl one, and then you jump into your pattern repeat, which is knit one, purl one. Again, I'm beginning as if this was the wrong side of my fabric because I want the right side to have that really nice edge that I created with the long tail cast on. As I go down the row, I should finish with a purl one. So I began with a purl one and I'll end with a purl one. This is important because I split my yarn there. What we are doing is we are keeping the edge stitches of our entire garment in stockinette stitch. That means the first stitch and the last stitch of the entire sweater will be knit on the right side and purl on the wrong side. And that's a very important thing to note. When you turn your work, you will notice that I am looking at a knit stitch, which is great because as I'm working in ribbing, I want to make sure that I am knitting my knits and purling my purls. So if I ever happen to forget which row I'm on, all I have to do is look at my stitches as I'm working in the ribbing pattern and just make sure that I knit my knits and purl my purls. One thing that I like to do when I'm working with ribbing like this, because it is pretty reversible, is I still like to mark the right side of my fabric. So I am going to go ahead and I'm just going to grab a marker here. You can use any sort of removable stitch marker you wish. And I'm simply just going to place it on the right side of my fabric. And if I buttoned that up, it would stay there in place and it would give me a visual of what is the right side of my fabric throughout the entire sweater itself, which again is just going to be a reminder that one side is the right side, one side is the wrong side, and it will help me know that I have to do knits, right? I have to start off with a knit on my right side, start off with a purl on my wrong side, so that way I keep the edges in stockinette. You will go ahead and work in the 1x1 ribbing until you reach the distance that is listed for the size you're making. I'm making the smallest size, so this is 2 inches, and you can see here I have my marker to indicate that this is the right side of my fabric. Now I'm ready to move on to the leash slit. The leash slit is going to be the center 5 stitches. So if you take your total number of cast on stitches and subtract 5, whatever you're remaining with, divide that in half, and then you will go ahead and work in your knit 1, purl 1 ribbing all the way across that number of stitches. Then we will bind off 5 stitches, and then the remaining stitches you will work as normal. For example, I have 45 stitches cast on here. So if I subtract 5 from 45, that leaves me with 40. So if I take 40 and divide it by 2, I have 20. So I'm going to work across 20 stitches, bind off 5, and that will leave me with 20 stitches. So that will get my center 5 stitches bound off. I could go ahead and count this out and mark it, but I want to go ahead and just count my stitches as I work them. So I'm going to work across 20 stitches. Make sure you're following the number that you need to work across for the size you're making. 18, 19, and 20. So those are my 20 stitches. Now I have to bind off 5 stitches. So I will go ahead and work 2 stitches in pattern. So I knit 1 and purl 1, then I have that back stitch jump up and over the front stitch. So I've bound off 1. Knit the next stitch, back stitch, jump over the front stitch, I bound off 2. 3, 4, and 5. So I bound off 5 stitches. Okay, this stitch right here will count into all of my stitches over here, and I will have a total of 20 stitches. So let me go ahead and finish this row. Now that I have finished this row, we can see that I have a nice little opening right there. On the row going back, I'm going to cast on 5 stitches to get back into the right number of stitches that I originally started with. So even though I bound off 5, I'm going to cast on 5 when I get to this point. So I will go ahead and turn my work and work over to those bind off stitches. Remember, you want to keep all of the edge stitches in stockinette, so make sure you knit on the right side, purl on the wrong side, on the outside edge stitches. All right, so we've bound off those stitches, and we're going to use a simple backwards E cast on to add 5 stitches. So if you grasp your yarn just like so, take your thumb and scoop it around the yarn. It's just like you're in a position as if this was the long tail cast on portion over the thumb. Now take your right hand needle, going from the base of the thumb towards the tip, and just scoop that yarn off and give it a nice tug. So you've just cast on 1 stitch. You repeat, grasp your yarn, scoop around, and then place that on. So now I have 5 stitches cast on. I will skip all of those bound off stitches, and I will come right over here to where the other side of my work is and continue on working over there in pattern to the end of the row. When you reach the end of the row, you can go ahead and turn your work, and let's take a look at what we have here. We can see I have a nice little opening. That's where the leash will go through. And I have this nice ribbing completed, and this is the portion that would go around the neck of your dog. After you've completed the slit for the leash, you're actually going to change to color B, and we will knit across this entire row. So you don't want to cut your color A. Leave that attached, okay? So my color B is actually this beautiful like tangerine color right here. I love it. Hopefully you can see it well enough. And I know you're not supposed to put knots in your knitting, but I absolutely hate it when my yarn flops around when I change colors. So I always just tie an overhand like tie. It's not even really a knot. I'm just putting a tie. I put the new color tied onto the old color, and I just scoot it right up to the edge, okay? When I go to weave in on my ends, I'll untie that knot and get rid of it. But this is just my preferred way. I just like it better when I'm working with color work. So I'm going to try and move this pink out of the way best possible so it's not hindering your view. And I'm going to take this beautiful color and go ahead and continue on in pattern. Now you'll notice we are supposed to be on the right side, and I have my right side marked just so it's really easy for me to know. And I'm going to knit this entire row. So I'm ignoring the fact that we had ribbing, and I'm just going to knit all of the stitches. When I get to those 5 stitches that I cast on, I do have to pay attention and make sure that I don't accidentally drop one. And not because it can't be fixed, it's why. I just want to make sure that I keep it on there so I don't have to worry about having to fix a drop stitch. But also, they're going to be a little bit looser than the stitches that I'm working right now. So here we are. I'm coming up to my stitches that I cast on. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead, make sure I go into the stitch just like I normally would, and just knit it. Even though it looks like it's just a twisted piece of yarn on my needle, you just take your time and knit them. They're a little bit loosey-goosey, but that's the nature of this particular way of casting on stitches mid-row. But it is one of the easiest ways to do it, so I figured I would just show you that one. And then carry on. Yay! So you can see there, I just worked across those stitches, no big deal. And I'm going to get to the end of the row. Okay, so we've reached the end of our row. This is the end of the leash slit section. As we take a look, we have our nice ribbing completed, the slit is there, and we have color B on the needle. It's at this point that we are now going to work our increases for the body of the sweater. As we work these increases, we are also going to work in our slip stitch striping sequence, okay? That pattern is listed right up on the first page, right next to the notes. All of the instructions are there. So it will be a little bit of flipping back and forth with your pages until you get used to the stitch pattern, so that way you can follow along with the particular row you're on for that stitch pattern. And then if you go back, you need to make sure that you're following along with the instructions. So I'm going to give you a brief sort of rundown of what we're going to do here, okay? As we are going to work on this next section, so I'm going to turn my work, so I start on the wrong side. We are going to first keep our outside edge stitches in stockinette. So if I'm on my wrong side, I will purl the first stitch and purl the last stitch. If I'm on the right side, I would knit the first stitch, knit the last stitch, okay? So that's the first thing to remember. The second thing to remember as we're working through these increases is that when we are increasing on the wrong side, we will do a make one purl. When we're increasing on the right side, we will just do a make one knit. Okay, so what's really convenient is if you pair up those two things I just told you. If you're on the wrong side, you purl the first stitch, and if it's an increase row, you'll do a make one purl. Pretty convenient. We can keep that consistent. The opposite of that is if you're on the right side, you would knit the first stitch. And if you're on an increase row, you do a make one knit. Okay, so that will be a really good way for you to think about, oh, which make one do I do? Well, am I on the right side or the wrong side? So that will help you work through that. Another way to think about it is we want our body of the sweater to be in stockinette stitch. So even though we are working in this pattern stitch, the pattern stitch still keeps a stockinette stitch pattern. So we want to keep our knits on the right side and our purls on the wrong side. Okay, the next thing I want to point out is that we are going to be increasing back to back. So we will do one row even and then do an increase row and an increase row. One row even, increase row, increase row. One row even, increase row, increase row. Does that make sense? So, and when I say one row even, all that means is you're going to be following the stripe sequence, however it's written, without any increases, okay? So if you remember that you are going to do even, increase, increase, even, increase, increase, that will help you not really have to go back and forth in the pattern as much because you'll be able to remember when you increased or when you did not. Here's another thing you need to know. As we are working the pattern stitch and the increases, you will not work the actual pattern stitch into those increases until both increases are complete. Here's why. If the pattern stitch sequence is a multiple of 2, you want to make sure that you have those 2 extra stitches on the pattern multiple in order to work into it. If you start using the pattern multiple within the stitches that you've increased before you have enough stitches to actually work through a full multiple, you're going to get off track. So the best way to keep track of that is to make sure that your slip stitches are in the right order. And as you start establishing the pattern, that will make sense. I will give you my little tips of how I try and make sure that my stitch pattern sequence is on point until I have enough stitches increased to incorporate those into my stitch pattern multiple. So that should help. All of this is to kind of give you the prep work of, hey, you can actually do this, but these are some things you have to pay attention to. Okay, I know that's a lot to throw at you, but let's review it just one more time. You keep the edge stitches in stockinette. As you're doing your increases, you will do a make one knit on the right side or a make one purl on the wrong side. You will work increases back to back, separated by one row of even knitting. So it will be even knitting, increase, increase, even knitting, increase, increase. Last but not least, as you're working the striped sequence or the slip stitch stripe sequence, you want to make sure that you're maintaining that stitch multiple within the correct number of stitches. So only incorporate your increased stitches as there's enough to create the multiple. All right, let's work through all of that together, but at least that gives you the prep work, okay? Let's jump in. I am on the wrong side of my fabric, which is what I'm supposed to be on according to the pattern. I still have my color A attached. We will not be cutting any of our yarn as we're working along. We want to carry it up. And I will jump into the first row. It says beginning with row 1, work the slip stitch stripes pattern across. Well, row 1 of the slip stitch stripe pattern is just knit. So I am going to knit with my color B all the way across. Simple enough so far, right? After that long explanation, it's nice that we start off with something really simple. All right, so I'm knitting my last few stitches. As I move on to the next row, it is my first increase row. And if I look at my slip stitch stripe pattern, I also have to change colors at this point. So let me go ahead and grab my color C. And I'm going to tie my color C just with an overhand tie on my color B and just pull it up. It just keeps things stable for me. I like that. I'm also going to keep my color A and my color B attached. So I am not going to undo those, okay? I want to keep those attached. And now I carry on. So this is where I want to have a couple things I will remember. 1, my first and my last stitch are going to be knits because I'm on my right side. 2, I am on my increase row, which means when I do my make one, I'm going to do a make one increase knit right there. I'll do a make one increase knit right there. Okay. 3, as I'm working across this row, I want to make sure I'm working in the slip stitch stripe sequence. There's a lot of things to remember here, but we can do it. All right, so this first stitch is going to be knit. So let's go ahead and knit that first stitch. And it's time to do a make one knit. To do a make one knit, I'm going to hold this apart. Can you see that string right there? I'm going to pick it up with that. You see that string right there? We are going to use our left-hand needle and scoop up that string from front to back. Okay, I'm going to do that again so you can see it. Left-hand needle, I'm going to scoop up that string from front to back. Now that string is resting on my left-hand needle just like it normally would if it was a stitch, right? Because I don't want to get a big hole, I now want to make sure that I knit this string through the back leg in order to twist it, thus creating a stitch. So I'm going to take my right hand needle and I'm going to go into the back leg of that stitch I just picked up, that string. Can you see that? I'm in the back leg. I go ahead, yarn over my right hand needle, pull that yarn over through the stitch like I normally would, and then let it jump off the needle. I've now twisted that stitch. Can you see that twist right there? So I should not get a very big hole because I've twisted that stitch and I've worked my increase. Fantastic. I now have one extra stitch that I did not plan on for my stitch multiple. So this is not written in the pattern, but this is how I make sure I keep track of what stitches are in my stitch pattern multiple so that I don't get messed up. I will go ahead and grab a marker and I'm going to place that marker right on my right hand needle. Now I can go ahead and carry on in the slip stitch pattern sequence. So the pattern starts off with a knit 1. Now you'll notice there are instructions in brackets. All that means is everything that is within those brackets, you will repeat all the way across the row. So the first part says we will slip 1 with yarn and back. So I'm going to go into the stitch as if to purl and slip it with my yarn and back, and then knit my next stitch. Slip it with the yarn and back and knit my next stitch. Slip with my yarn and back, knit my next stitch. I will repeat this all the way down to my very last stitch. I'm to my last stitch. I will go ahead and grab a second stitch marker and place that on there, indicating that's the end of my stitch pattern repeat. Now I need to do a make one knit. So I'm going to take my left hand needle and scoop up that string, okay? Move that color out of the way. Now that string is resting on my needle just like it would be if it was an actual stitch. And so I want to make sure I knit it through the back leg so that way it gets twisted and I have an extra stitch, no hole, and I finish off with a knit 1 because I'm on the right side of my fabric. So at the end of this row, you should have stitches on the outside that are with color C, and then all your stitches in between here will be one or the other. It'll be, it will go CB, 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 all the way down, and then you'll end with 2 color Cs once again. I do want to remind you that the stitch markers are something that I like to add. It is not written in the pattern. So if you do not want to add these stitch markers, you absolutely don't have to. Let's move on to the next row. As we turn our work and we look at our instructions, we know that we are going to work another increase row, which we already knew that, right? Because we know that our increase rows have to be back to back. So we did one increase row, now we're doing our second. We already know how the increases are going to go because we're on the wrong side. We know we have to purl this first stitch, and as we work our increase, because we're on the wrong side, we'll do a make one purl. So let's go ahead and start off with that. Get my yarn in position, and I will purl this first stitch. Now, going into this stitch, once again, I'm going to go from front to back. Okay, now I'm gonna drop that yarn just so that I can show you through how to do this because this is a little bit tricky. We want to purl through that back leg there. And what that means is we have to take our right hand needle and going from the left side of the back leg to the right side, we want to put our needle through that back leg. Okay? Now I'm going to try and hold this so you can see. So I'm through that back leg. Can you see that? This is what it looks like from the front side. And then I would go ahead and purl it. And that is a make one purl. You want to see that again? I'm going to show you one more time. Let me go ahead and let that one go off the needle. I'm going to scoop that up from front to back and then going from left to right through that back leg, left to right. Okay, and not only am I going through that back leg, but notice I'm not overlapping that front leg. Okay, so I go from left to right and it comes this direction. Can you see? I'm coming in the stitch and it comes up here. And then I purl it. Once I've done that, I can go ahead and work the rest of the pattern. I know I'm not yet ready to work my pattern sequence because I'm not to my marker. So this extra stitch I have here, I want to keep that in stockinette stitch. So I will go ahead and purl it. So let's purl that stitch. Now I can slip my marker, and that's why I keep my markers there. Is now I know I'm in the section that works for my slip stitch stripe sequence. So I am on row 3, so I will start off with a purl 1, and then with my yarn in front, I will go into the next stitch as if to purl and slip it off. Purl 1, as if to purl and slip it off. See how this goes? So remember when I said we're still working in stockinette, it's just we have this really cool sequence going along. So I'm on my wrong side and my slip stitches are just like normal, only I'm keeping my yarn in front, and then I'm just purling the next stitch. When I get to my marker, I simply slip my marker. I will purl that stitch because I'm on the wrong side. And then I have to do a make one purl again. So I scoop up that string. Okay, so I have that string there. And I'm going to make sure my yarn's in front. I'm going to go into the back leg of that stitch as if to purl. Yarn over and then purl out. Purl my last stitch. All right, so let's see here. This is what I have. You can see I've got stitches out here on the outside, and I've got all of my sequins in order here. The next row is a plain row, meaning we are not going to work any increases. We're simply going to follow our slip stitch striping sequence. The good news is, as I rotate this around to my next row, and knowing that our stitch multiple for our striping sequence is 2, we now have 2 stitches out here and 2 stitches out here. So I can go ahead and remove these markers on the next row and then reapply them when I do my increase row. It's also time for me to switch back to color B. So I'm going to no longer work with my color C. I will grab my color B, it's right here, and just float it right up the side and begin working with my color B. So let's go ahead and work this row. I'm on the right side, so I can go ahead and knit my first stitch just like I'm supposed to. And following the sequence, I'm simply going to knit this entire row. When I get to my markers on this row, I will go ahead and remove it and then finish off knitting the whole row. You will now notice in the pattern it has you repeating those last 3 rows until you reach the designated number of stitches that you need for the size sweater you're making. What I want to do is walk you through the next 3 rows, show you how to place those markers once again, and to remind you that when you're working your increases on the right side, you do the knit one, make one knit. And when you're working your increases on the wrong side, you do your purl one and then make one purl. So let me walk you through those next 3 rows. Or if you are confident in your skills and you want to carry on, go ahead and move on until you get to the next step. We begin with row 5 of the slip stitch pattern. And so I am on the wrong side, so I begin with my purl one. Then I want to do a make one purl because this is an increase row. Take my left hand needle, go from front to back and scoop up that bar. Now I take my right hand needle and going from left to right, I'm going to put my needle through the back leg of that bar. It is a little tricky, take your time. And once it's in there, go ahead and purl that stitch and off. Once I've worked my increase, this is where I'll add my stitch marker again. So I'll go ahead and grab my stitch marker and place it on there. And I know that I'm ready to jump into my pattern sequence. And for this, row 5 has me knit the entire row. So I will go ahead and knit down to the last stitch of my row. I am to the last stitch of my row. Again, I want to grab my marker, place it on my right hand needle, and then I want to do a make one purl. So I scoop that string up from front to back, make sure my yarn is in front, go into the back leg of that string I just scooped up, and go in as if to purl. Again, it is tricky, guys, so take your time. All right, and then purl it and off, and then purl that last stitch. So that was my first increase row of my set, right? So as I turn my work, I know that I am on row 6 of my pattern sequence and I'm on my second increase. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on to row 6. Row 6 has us going back to color A. So I'm going to come down here, grab my color A, and as I bring it up, I do want to make sure that I am not puckering any stitches, okay? So what I mean here is that, let me get all of this string organized. When I pull this up over here on the side, I want to make sure I'm not pulling it super tight. I want to make sure I have a nice even float right there, okay? I'm on the knit side of my fabric, so let's go ahead and jump in with my knit one. And then I have to do a make one knit, so I will take the left hand needle, scoop up that string, go into the back leg of that string, yarn over and knit. The next stitch, I want to go ahead and knit it. Remember, I want to keep those in stockinette. Here's my marker, so I slip my marker, and that lets me know that I'm ready to jump into my slip stitch stripes pattern. For this row and the next row, I'm only going to knit. So I will go ahead and knit down to my marker. If you are not using markers, you would knit down to the last stitch. I am to my marker here, so I can go ahead, slip my marker over. I will knit this stitch, and then I will do my make one in this spot. So I scoop up that bar, go into the back leg, and do my knit one, and finish off with my knit stitch. That was my second increase row, okay? So now I know that I'm gonna do one row plain. Remember, it's increase, increase, even, increase, increase, even. So as I turn my work here and I begin row 7, I'm only worrying about my slip stitch stripe sequence. This is also the row I can remove my markers again, and then I will reapply them at the start of my next increase row. This first stitch, I wanna start off with a purl one. And knowing that these 2 stitches are now going to be working into the sequence, I can go ahead and knit these first 2 stitches, remove my marker, and then continue on knitting. I'm getting to my marker here, so I'm gonna make sure it's out of the way, and I want to remove it. I can knit these last 2 and purl the final one. All right, so we can say that is the end of row 7. I go ahead, turn my work, and you can see that the pattern stitch is really starting to take shape here. We have our nice slip stitches going on here, separated by wonderful garter stitch, and we're working our increases. So these increases are making it so that way it will fit nicely over the dog's body. Go ahead and continue on repeating that sequence. Increase, increase, even. Increase, increase, even, until you've reached the number of stitches that you need in the pattern. Once you've reached that number of stitches, you then want to work evenly in the stitch pattern until this part of the sweater measures 2 inches from the leash slit. Okay, so from the leash slit, you want to go until it reaches 2 inches evenly. That might be only a couple rows, it might be several rows. It all depends on your gauge and the size you're making. Once you've reached 2 inches, you want to make sure that you've ended on a row 5, 11, or 17. Once you've done that, it's time to create the placement for the front legs of the sweater. Before you leave, I do want to point out that if your stitches are starting to get really crammed onto your straight needles, you can transfer over to circular needles and use them as straights whenever you choose. And it's really easy to do. Make sure you are using the same size needle that you are knitting with, and just discard the needle you would put into your right hand and instead grab one of the needles from your circular needles. Then go ahead and work whatever row you're on. It doesn't matter when you do this. I happen to be on row 8, so I'm going to go ahead and work my row 8. And row 8 is my increase row, so I will go ahead and knit my first stitch and then work my increase. So it would be a make 1 knit increase. I still add my stitch marker just like I did before, and now I'll jump into my stitch pattern. But notice all my stitches are now going onto my circular needle. So as I get to the end of this row, I will have all the stitches on my circular needle, and I can go ahead and use that instead of my straights. I will not be working in the round. I'm simply going to have those stitches with a little bit more room to them. Oop, I almost knit that one. So I'll have my stitches spaced out a little bit more, which will be nice. I'm going to get to the end so I can show you how this will look. To my last stitch, this is where I add my marker, do my make 1 knit, and then knit my last stitch. Now this straight needle is done, so I won't be using it anymore. I will turn my work. Okay, I'm still turning my work. I'm on circulars, but I still have to turn. I will grab the other end of my circular needle and put it in my right hand and use it just like it was a straight needle. But see how much more room I have with all of my stitches? I can space them out a little bit more, and it's just easier to knit that way. So should you choose to transfer from straight needles to circulars and still using them as straights, you can do that. And you can do that whenever you want. I happen to do it right now, but you can do it whenever you want. All right, go ahead and get that 2 inches of length from the leash slit so that way we can work on the front legs. You've reached your 2 inches. It's getting pretty easy now, right? It feels like you've kind of caught a rhythm, especially after you've finished those increases. Depending on where you stopped in your pattern, you are either getting ready to start a row 6, a row 12, or a row 18. I'm not exactly sure what you are doing on your end, but I will let you know I'm making the smallest size, and I'm getting ready to move on to a row 6. So as I move on to row 6, I am going to use my color A, which is the nice pink color, and I'm going to prepare this particular project for the front leg holes. What I need when I do that is I need a scrap yarn. So I've grabbed a completely different color that I'm using in my pattern, and I will use this for my scrap yarn. What we want to do is we will knit over the number of stitches we need to. And I say knit, but you will be following the striped sequence pattern. So whatever it is in your pattern, you want to make sure you're doing that. You'll work that over the number of stitches we're supposed to. Then we will knit on scrap yarn the number of stitches you're supposed to knit for the size you're making. Then we will put those stitches back on and we'll grab our regular yarn and knit across those scrap yarn stitches. Then we'll do the same thing over here because we have two front legs. That is, if your dog is like most dogs. So let's go ahead and do that. So you want to make sure you do have the pattern in front of you so you know exactly how many stitches you will be working across. But essentially the placement and the mechanics of what we're going to be doing is exactly like what I'm doing. So I have my color A ready to go, and I am so grateful I switched over to my circular needles because I have so much more space with the stitches. I like it. So if you haven't switched over to circulars yet, I do recommend doing that. All right, so I am going to keep in my stitch pattern, and I have to work over 8 stitches. So my stitch pattern, I'm just knitting. So 1, all right, so I knit over 8 stitches. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Now with my scrap yarn, I need to knit 11 stitches. So I'm going to grab my scrap yarn. Make sure you leave a tail so it doesn't accidentally get pulled out. 1, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11. If you did a different number, make sure you've worked that particular number. Once you've done these waste yarn stitches, you want to slip those stitches back onto your left hand needle. You'll notice I'm just going through the back leg of each stitch and slipping them right back over to my left hand needle. It'll be easy to tell which one's the first one because it's all done in that scrap yarn color. I'm going to go ahead and cut because my yarn was still attached to its ball of yarn. All right, so once I've done that, here's a little something that I do. I will tie the two ends, not super tight, just make a little knot so that they don't go anywhere, so it doesn't accidentally get pulled out. It's just something I've always done, so I'm going to do it again. Now, back with our original color. So for me, I'm back with color A. I will go ahead and continue on in my pattern across these stitches. And for me, that means I'm just knitting. So I will knit across these stitches. All right, so what we've done here is these stitches that we have knit with scrap yarn and then knit into the scrap yarn. Later on, when we go to pull out that scrap yarn, we're going to have live stitches there that we will then be able to pick up and actually work the little border around the leg opening, okay? So once you've hit this part, we will continue on in pattern, working the number of stitches as listed in your pattern. For me, I have to work another 31. So I'm going to continue on in my pattern and do 31 knit stitches. Once I've reached those 31 for me, I will now grab scrap yarn again and work across 11 stitches. Remember, you want to work the number of stitches as indicated in the pattern for the size you're making. I did one too many. All right, so I've done 11. I'm going to move those back. All right, so those stitches are back on there. Let me snip that one. Grab my working yarn again and then knit across these stitches. This is why I always tie these, because I'm always afraid I'm going to accidentally pull one. And I don't tie them really tight because I still want my work to move around with me. But I just make it so that if it were accidentally pulled, it doesn't get pulled out completely. Just precaution. Once you've knit across all of your scrap yarn stitches, you go ahead, continue on in pattern to the end of the row. All right, so I've worked that entire row, and if I set this down, let me get all that yarn out of the way so you can take a peek. You can see where the blue is, that's where I have set up my legs for my doggy sweater. So that's where the front legs will come through. At this point, you get to go ahead and continue on working the back of the sweater, following along with the slip stitch stripe sequence. You will work the back of the sweater until it measures the distance that's written in the pattern. I'm really trying hard not to confuse many of you, so that's why I keep telling you to go back to your pattern. And that's why I started this whole video out telling you to make sure you mark the size you're making and then find all the numbers that pertain to the size you're making so that you are sure to always be following along with the right stitch count, okay? Once you have reached that measurement, you would carry on with the next set of instructions. You'll notice that the instructions are written for the back end shaping separately for the extra small, the medium, and the large. So you will want to make sure that you are following the sequence of the pattern that for the size you're making. Let me go ahead. I'm going to get mine to the size I need. And I remember I'm making the extra small because I have 2 Chihuahuas, so I can have one of them wear this. I have a little girl and a little boy, so I'll probably give this to Lucy, the little girl. I'm going to get this to the size it needs to be for the extra small, and then I will come back here and I will walk you through the extra small instructions. And if there's anything different on the other set of instructions for the other sizes, I'll be sure to point those out as well. So go ahead, finish the back of your sweater. Join me back here for the next set of instructions. You've made it this far. Don't give up yet. Finish your body of the sweater and then join me for part 2 to see the conclusion of this super cute sweater that I made for Lucy.